Hello, government students. This is a lecture on Learning Module 11 about the federal bureaucracy. These are the objectives that you should be able to complete at the conclusion of the learning module. In this lecture, I hope to answer 3 questions for you. First, what is a bureaucracy? Second, why do we have a federal bureaucracy and how did it come into being? And third, how does the national government manage the federal bureaucracy? So we'll start with the first question. What is a bureaucracy? Your textbook defines it this way: an administrative group of non-elected officials charged with carrying out functions connected to a series of policies and programs. That's a rather vague definition, in my opinion, so I'm going to evaluate it for you. First of all, what does it mean that bureaucracies carry out functions connected to a series of policies and programs? The work of a bureaucracy is to implement public policy. That is also called public administration, the implementation of public policy by government bureaucracies. Public policies are the rules that governments write and implement in order to solve the problems of the governed society and to provide the goods and services that the people demand of their government. So the work of a bureaucracy often involves providing services to the people. Some of America's first bureaucratic organizations did just that. For one example, going back to the early years of American history, the U.S. Postal Service carried mail from location to location on behalf of the people for just the price of a stamp. Somewhat more recently, during the Great Depression, many different bureaucracies were formed to provide jobs to people and to help farmers who were struggling in the Midwest. Beginning in the Second Industrial Revolution during the late 1800s, bureaucracies were first used to regulate. The very first regulatory bureaucracy was the Interstate Commerce Commission, a bureaucracy that we studied in our discussion of federalism earlier in the semester. The ICC, or the Interstate Commerce Commission, was formed to regulate the business operations of railroad companies to prevent them from charging unfair rates for their transportation. More recently, several bureaucracies were formed in the 1970s to regulate businesses in their emission of pollutants into the air, land, and water. These public policies that bureaucracies are implementing are determined by Congress and the President. They are established by laws enacted by elected representatives at the behest of the majority of voters. So the primary function of a bureaucracy is to carry out the laws of the country. Second, what do we mean by an administrative group of non-elected officials? Bureaucrats, the individuals working in the bureaucracies, are not elected. Most of them are hired. They are also called civil servants because they are civilian employees of the national government. They are paid from the tax dollars that the national government collects from its citizens. These civil servants make up the administrative groups that are the bureaucratic arm of our government. They together are organized with a structured hierarchy. There is an entry-level employee, middle management, upper management, and finally a head or leader that might be called a director, a commissioner, or a secretary. These leaders are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. So at the higher levels of bureaucracies, the bureaucrats are appointed. But that is a very small number of bureaucrats. Most bureaucrats are hired, just as they might be in a private business organization. So why are they hired? Bureaucrats are highly skilled workers. They are hired to implement the laws that require a high level of expertise that elected lawmakers do not possess. They are FBI agents, bomb technicians, computer technicians, IT magicians, the people who protect us from being hacked by foreign adversaries and terrorists. They are foreign diplomats, engineers, scientists, forest rangers, lawyers, doctors. The list goes on and on and on. They are hired because they have the skills the government needs to provide services to the people and to regulate businesses in the interest of the common good. But bureaucracies are not private businesses. They are not profit-driven. The goal of a bureaucracy is not to make money or increase market share. Rather, the goal of a bureaucracy is to serve the people in the most effective and efficient way possible. Bureaucracies do not have shareholders. They answer to the people, all the people, not just to wealthy investors. Government bureaucracies are highly specialized. Each one covers a very specific policy area. There are many different organizations that make up the federal government bureaucracy. This image shows a variety of different government bureaucracies, just a few of them. There are actually over 400 different government bureaucracies. So we try to categorize them, and here I've got them categorized into 3 types. First, executive departments. There are 15 executive departments that have been organized by presidents with permission from Congress over the course of U.S. history. The head of each one is called a secretary, and as I mentioned a moment ago, the heads of departments are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. The secretaries make up the president's cabinet, and they answer directly to the president. Each department has a specific policy area on which the secretary will advise the president. If you go in your textbook, chapter 15, and look at figure 15.9, you'll see an example, which I believe is the Department of State, and it shows a very specialized hierarchy or division of labor within that one single department. That's just to give you an example of how executive departments are organized. One of these departments that you see in this image here, the Department of Education, you should know that that particular department is presently being dismantled by the Trump administration. That's the Department of Education. The Department of Education was formed in 1979 to administer funding for public schools and see that minority groups, African Americans, women, and disabled students receive equal access to public education. It most recently was responsible for managing financial aid to college students through both loans and grants. It implements the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, manages Title I funding to public schools that serve low-income students, and ensures compliance with Title IX laws that prohibit discrimination in public schools. President Trump's executive order to dismantle the Department of Education directs that the responsibility for these services be shifted to the state governments and to some extent to parents, though it is likely that the financial support that was being managed by the Department of Education may be shifted to the Treasury Department. So if Congress goes along with Trump's agenda, it will officially eliminate the Department of Education, and we'll just have 14 executive departments instead of 15. I just wanted you to be aware of that. The next type of government bureaucracy we'll call agencies or commissions. Some resources, including your textbook, suggest that these are 2 separate types of government agencies, but for purposes of this class, let's just group them together and take note of these aspects of bureaucratic agencies or commissions. Some agencies are executive agencies. They are formed by the president, even though they are not directly part of any executive department. The heads of these independent executive agencies still are appointed by the president with the confirmation of the Senate, but they are formed to help the president carry out the executive function, the implementation of the laws that Congress enacts. Bureaucratic agencies can also be regulatory. They can be formed by Congress through a process known as delegation. Congress will write a more general law for a specific policy area, and then as part of that law, Congress forms an agency to draft the more detailed regulations of that policy area. This is where the skill and expertise of civil servants becomes so valuable. These people have the necessary education and talents to properly regulate in their policy area, such as engineers, biologists, doctors, etc. These regulatory agencies, though, don't just write the regulations, they may also enforce them through audits or inspections and even fines. Regulatory agencies may even have their own administrative court system to adjudicate violations of the regulations. So these regulatory agencies wind up performing all three government functions: lawmaking, law enforcement, and law interpretation. But agencies cannot perform these functions arbitrarily. Regulatory agency operations are governed by the Administrative Procedures Act. There is a great deal of oversight by Congress over the agency's operations, just as the president has oversight over the independent executive agencies. The third type of government bureaucracy is a government corporation. Government corporations are government-run business organizations that provide services to the public. The best examples might be the U.S. Postal Service and Amtrak. Amtrak is the passenger train service provided by the national government. The public does pay for these services, but only in the amount necessary to cover the actual cost. There is no profit motive involved with a government corporation. So that's a little bit about what government bureaucracies are and what they do. Now we'll look at the history of their formation. Why do we have a federal bureaucracy, and how did it come into being? Well, first of all, it is a very old institution. America is not the first country to have government bureaucracies. Bureaucracies have been around in many other countries for longer than America has existed. The U.S. Constitution does not create government bureaucracies. You will not find an article in the Constitution that establishes a bureaucratic branch of the government. However, the Constitution does seem to contemplate their existence. For example, in Article 1, Section 8, which we studied in a previous learning module, Congress is given numerous specific lawmaking powers, and all of those powers couldn't realistically be accomplished by just the members of Congress. It just requires so many people working together to provide road construction, to coin money, to gather taxes and distribute resources. So in that way, the Constitution assumes that Congress will form other organizations to carry out some of its functions. Also, Article 2 gives the president the power to appoint officers and department heads, to require written opinions from them, and see that the laws are faithfully executed. This language also assumes that the president will organize some type of government bureaucracy. Under the Articles of Confederation, the Confederation government, 3 bureaucratic organizations were formed by Congress: the Department of Foreign Affairs, which we now call the Department of State, the Department of the Treasury, and the Department of War, which we now call the Department of Defense. Our first president, George Washington, inherited these agencies, or these departments, inherited these 3 departments, and he formed the first presidential cabinet. So government bureaucracies are not unique to America, nor are they new in America. They've been with us for a very long time. But the federal bureaucracy has grown over time as the people have demanded and needed that its government provide goods and services. As time passed, the needs of the nation required the formation of additional government bureaucracies. For example, during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln formed the Department of Agriculture to help the Union grow crops and feed Union troops. Just after the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln formed the Pension Office to help disperse financial benefits to Union veterans. During the Industrial Revolution, Congress formed the Interstate Commerce Commission, something I've mentioned previously in this lecture, to combat the unfair trade practices of the huge transportation and oil corporations that were operating. During the Depression, Congress and President Roosevelt formed many government bureaucracies to provide services to the poor and unemployed and to boost the national economy. A little bit later, under President Johnson, Lyndon Johnson, many more government bureaucracies were formed to support public education and to help the poor. Following 9/11, President Bush and Congress formed the Department of Homeland Security to help the nation fight domestic terrorism. And these are just a few examples and reasons why the federal government bureaucracy has grown so large. It's always been to meet a need of the governed people. So, with all of these different organizations, these bureaucracies, how does our national government go about managing them? The national government has the responsibility to manage all these government bureaucracies, and I'd like to explain just how that's done. It's through staffing, guidance, and oversight. The national government chooses who works for the bureaucratic organizations. It provides the laws that guide their operation, and it oversees and audits their performance. Let's start with staffing for just a minute. In our earliest bureaucracy, the one I mentioned with George Washington, when there were still just very few, just those 3 executive departments, our nation was very young and very small, and the employees of those 3 departments were selected for their expertise and their relationship with our elected leaders. For example, George Washington appointed Alexander Hamilton to be his Secretary of the Treasury. Thomas Jefferson appointed James Madison to be his Secretary of State. These men knew each other. They were part of the group that formed our national government. But in the 1930s, there was a marked shift in this staffing system. President Andrew Jackson is notorious for using government jobs as a reward for political loyalty. He appointed his political supporters to the high-level leadership positions in government bureaucracies. This process of rewarding political loyalty with positions in government bureaucracies is known as political patronage. Now, there is an obvious flaw in political patronage: corruption, or you might call it cronyism. And that is a valid criticism, especially when the people receiving the rewards, the high-level government jobs, are not actually qualified to do the work they're appointed to do. And that makes government very inefficient. But there is an upside to it as well. Assuming that the employees and appointees are in fact qualified, having politically loyal people serving in these jobs will make the government work more efficiently because the president can trust that they will carry out his or her agenda. They won't be pushing back against the president or trying to impose their own policy agenda. But outrage at the corruption that is inherent in political patronage prompted Congress to enact laws that were intended to shift the system of staffing in these government bureaucracies to a merit-based system. This is a reform effort that began in the mid to late 1800s. The bureaucratic organizations ought not be political. They are formed to serve all the people of the nation, not to serve a particular president, not to serve just certain members of Congress. They're supposed to serve the good of all the American people, even the Americans who voted against the president or voted against those members of Congress. So a merit-based system that has been implemented is an effort to reform the laws and remove political corruption, to see that the bureaucracy serves the public effectively and efficiently. So as I said, this began in the mid to late 1800s. And we'll start with the Civil Service Reform Act of 1883. This act established the Civil Service Commission to see that selection, retention, and promotion of civil servants was based upon merit, not political patronage. It required job applicants to take a test showing that they were actually qualified for the positions. The act also made it illegal to fire someone just for political disloyalty. Other legislation was passed to reduce or eliminate the political involvement of bureaucrats in campaigns. An example was the Hatch Act of 1939. Later, Congress enacted the Freedom of Information Act. This act allows citizens to request records from federal agencies to gain information, and as you see in the title, about the activities of government agencies. A little bit later, Congress enacted the Sunshine Act. So when you hear the word sunshine, think shedding light on the activities of government agencies. This act required agencies to hold public meetings on a very regular basis, meetings that any person, any citizen of the country could attend and listen and watch what the government agencies are doing. One of the most important efforts at reform, and more recent effort too, is the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978. This act replaced this Civil Service Commission that had been formed here in 1883. This act replaced the Civil Service Commission with two new separate organizations. One, the Office of Personnel Management, the OPM there, which controls the selection and hiring of civil servants, those who are not appointed. The OPM will administer exams sometimes, but they are not the exams that were required by the earlier act in 1883 are no longer required quite as often. There are exams required for some positions, but not all. But still, the focus of the hiring now, what's conducted by the OPM, is merit-based. They're looking for qualified employees, not just people who have been politically loyal to elected representatives. The other organization that the 1978 Act formed was called the Merit Systems Protection Board. The MSPB conducts internal investigations of corruption and misuse of taxpayer funds. It also provides protection for whistleblowers. People who are reporting misdeeds within their bureaucracy are given anonymity and job protection. Now let's discuss guidance and oversight. The legal reforms that I mentioned related to staffing and reduction of political corruption. But Congress and the President have the responsibility of seeing that government bureaucracies serve the American people efficiently, wisely spending our tax dollars, and effectively accomplishing the goals of the American people. There are a variety of ways to analyze the productivity and quality of government bureaucracies. They come about through the study of government agencies as an academic discipline called, again, public administration. Public administration refers to both the implementation of public policy and government bureaucracies, which is the definition I gave it earlier in this lecture, but it also refers to the academic study of that implementation. You can have a job in public administration after having obtained a degree in public administration. Lander actually offers such a degree in public administration. And this practice aspect of public administration emerged and evolved over the course of history, as I've described already in this lecture. But the study of public administration did not begin until the late 1800s and early 1900s, once the practice of public administration had grown large enough to attract attention and provide a foundation of evidence as to its efficiency. And here are some of the models that we use to analyze the quality of government services. The first is called the Weberian model. It's hard to pronounce. This model was developed by sociologist Max Weber, and it sets up a model for the ideal government bureaucracy. So the ideal government bureaucracy is one that is non-political, hierarchical, and that consistently follows formal procedures. It assumes that agencies are necessary due to the size of our nation and government, the demand for government services, and the expertise required to carry out all the complex public policies of our very modern technical age. These other two models are looking at government bureaucracies with a more critical eye. The next one we call the acquisitive model. This model recognizes that there are limited resources available to fund bureaucracies, and that the heads of these bureaucracies know that. So they fight for the limited funding, the limited tax dollars available in the national budget. They fight for that by coming before these oversight committees of Congress and before the president to assure our elected officials of the relevance of their agency and to always spill the full allotment of tax dollars allotted to them to justify the need for those tax dollars. So under this model, bureaucracy will always remain bloated because there's no incentive to shrink the funding, no incentive to become more efficient, to depend on less money. That's a consequence of the nature of government bureaucracies. And so this model is going to consider government bureaucracies as competitive organizations because they're competing for limited funding. The third model we call the monopolistic model. This model assumes that bureaucracies are more like private monopolies because they each provide a unique service that cannot be obtained anywhere else. So if the service can't be obtained anywhere else, then there's no competition to drive prices lower or to provide more quality. An example of this is actually a state level bureaucracy, not a national government bureaucracy, but the DMV is an example of a monopolistic agency because it's the only place you can go to get your driver's license. It's the only place you can go to get your passport. Well, excuse me, that's wrong. You get your passport from the national government, but the DMV is the only place you can go to get a driver's license. So it has a monopoly over providing that service of getting your driver's license. So this model then assumes there's an absence of competition. And that absence of competition removes the incentive for the bureaucracy to be efficient and effective. Those three models are how the academic side of public administration contributes to the oversight of government bureaucracies. But that is not where oversight ends. There are other ways that Congress has provided a means for overseeing bureaucracies. Congress controls the funding of regulatory agencies. The heads of regulatory agencies have to report to congressional committees on the operations and spending of their agencies and to justify the budget for their operations. So if Congress is not pleased with the work of the agency, Congress will reduce or eliminate its funding. The Government Accountability Office audits executive agencies. The Office of Management and Budget receives reports on the performance of executive agencies. So there are many different checks and balances that are operating between the elected officials and the non-elected government bureaucracies to make sure that the bureaucracies are doing their job effectively and efficiently. The present trend in the management of government bureaucracies also includes shrinking the size of bureaucracies. President Bill Clinton oversaw the consolidation. This is in the 1990s, President Bill Clinton's administration. He oversaw the consolidation of several agencies and with bipartisan support actually managed to balance the federal budget. The second Trump administration is where we presently see the practice of eliminating many federal jobs. Tens of thousands of federal jobs have been eliminated. President Trump has targeted, in particular, the National Park Service, the U.S. Agency for International Development, as I mentioned earlier, the Department of Education, and the Department of Health and Human Services. These are just a few of the job cuts. There are many more. but it is part of a larger effort, the larger agenda of the second Trump administration to shrink certain parts of the government bureaucracy. And to accomplish this, President Trump is relying on Elon Musk and his DOGE organization, the Department of Government Efficiency. But don't be confused. The Department of Government Efficiency is not an executive department. It was not formed with Congress's approval. It was just something that Donald Trump decided to do. He sort of reorganized an office that was already existing, and allowed Elon Musk to serve as the manager of that office. But this office, DOGE, is the one that is carrying out the job cuts that are part of the agenda of the second Trump administration. Also, several presidential administrations have made an effort, and this is in more recent decades. Several presidents and members of Congress in recent decades have pursued privatization of some of the services that government bureaucracies had been providing. That effort's taken in several different forms. Full divestiture, which means passing the entire function of the bureaucracy over to a private business. Another form it's taken is contracting with private companies to perform narrow specific services. An example of that, I believe, is given in your textbook, is that during the Iraq War, our national government hired the Halliburton Corporation to provide military-based construction and food and laundry services during the Iraq War. A third measure of privatization is through joint ventures, where the government and a private company work together under a contract, where the company will finance the operation, but the government actually runs it. So those are the modern efforts, the most recent efforts, then to manage the federal bureaucracy. We've now reached the end of this lecture. You should go ahead now and complete your learning module assignments. Call or email me if you need any help with that.